In February 1969, Alice Roosevelt Longworth sat in her drawing room on Massachusetts Avenue, surrounded by men who controlled the direction of American policy. She was 84 years old. The senator to her left had just proposed legislation she found tedious. She told him so directly, in front of the others. He laughed, but his hands tightened around his glass. No one contradicted Alice, not anymore. The room itself was a curiosity. Victorian furniture that had survived decades without alteration, faded embroidered pillows, a needlepoint cushion bearing her most famous line, "If you haven't got anything nice to say, come sit by me." Journalists came to her for quotes that could end careers. Politicians came because refusing her invitation was worse than enduring her judgment. She had no official role, no elected position, no formal power. She had something else, the ability to make important men feel small. But the influence she wielded had a cost that was not immediately visible. It required a kind of hardness that did not come naturally, even to her. It required distance from her daughter, from affection, from anything that might soften the performance. By the time she was old enough to be feared, she had also become unreachable. The sharpness that made her famous had also made her alone. This is not a story about a woman who conquered Washington. It is a story about what that conquest required and what it left behind. Alice Lee Roosevelt was born on February 12, 1884, in a brownstone on West 57th Street in Manhattan. The labor was difficult. Her mother, also named Alice, had been ill for days before the birth, though no one understood the severity. Theodore Roosevelt was not in the house when his daughter arrived. He was at the New York State Assembly in Albany, where he served as a young assemblyman building a reputation for reform. A telegram reached him that night. A healthy baby girl had been born. He left immediately, arriving by train the next morning. By the time he walked through the door, his mother had died of typhoid fever in one room, and his wife was dying of undiagnosed Bright's disease, acute kidney failure, in another. Alice Lee Roosevelt died at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on February 14, 1884, 43 hours after giving birth. Theodore held her as she lost consciousness. He did not speak about it afterward, not in any detail. In his diary that night, he drew a large X on the page and wrote beneath it, "The light has gone out of my life." The baby was handed to Theodore's sister, Anna, called Bamie. Theodore could not look at the child for long. She had her mother's name, her mother's face beginning to form in miniature, and she had killed her mother simply by being born. He did not say this aloud, but he did not need to. He left New York within weeks, heading to the Badlands of Dakota Territory to recover himself in isolation and physical exhaustion. The baby stayed behind. Bamie Roosevelt was 30 years old, unmarried, living in Manhattan in a home she managed with strict efficiency. She was not warm by nature, but she was competent. The baby, called Baby Lee at first, to distinguish her from her dead mother, was fed, changed, and kept on a schedule. Bamie hired a nurse. Theodore sent money and brief letters. He did not visit often. For the first 3 years of her life, Alice lived in her aunt's house as a kind of permanent guest. She was a Roosevelt by name, but not by residence. Theodore remarried in December 1886 to Edith Caro, a woman he had known since childhood. Edith had loved him long before his first marriage, had stepped aside when he chose Alice Lee, and had waited. The wedding took place in London, away from New York society, and away from the memory of the first wife. Theodore did not bring his daughter to the ceremony. Alice remained with Bamie. Theodore and Edith moved into Sagamore Hill, the sprawling house Theodore had built on Long Island for his first wife. Edith redecorated. She removed photographs. She did not speak Alice Lee's name in the house, and Theodore followed her lead. The first wife became a silence that Alice, the daughter, would eventually learn to navigate around. The child was not neglected in the material sense. She had clothes, food, medical care, a nurse who kept her clean and quiet. But she did not have parents. Bamie was dutiful, not affectionate. Theodore was absent, and when he did visit, he was careful not to stay too long. The baby learned early that crying did not produce comfort, only efficiency. She stopped crying as often. In 1887, Edith gave birth to Theodore Jr., the first child of the second marriage. A son, Teddy, as he was called. The following year, Kermit was born. The family at Sagamore Hill was expanding, and Alice was still in Manhattan. Bamie began to suggest carefully that the child might be better served in her father's household. Edith resisted. She had not asked for another woman's child, and she did not pretend otherwise. But the arrangement was becoming untenable. Alice was 3 years old enough to notice things, and there were questions beginning to form in New York society about why Theodore Roosevelt's daughter did not live with him. In 1887, Theodore brought Alice to Sagamore Hill. She was introduced to the household as though she were a new arrival, not a returning daughter. Edith was polite. She assigned Alice a bedroom on the 3rd floor, away from the nursery where Teddy and Kermit slept. The nurse who had cared for Alice in Bamie's home was dismissed. Edith preferred her own staff. Alice was instructed to call Edith Mother, though Edith never called Alice her daughter in private. She referred to her as Theodore's child, or more often simply, Alice. The house itself was large and chaotic, full of children who would keep arriving. Ethel in 1891, Archibald in 1894, Quentin in 1897. Theodore loved noise, loved his children roughhousing and exploring and bringing home injured animals. He encouraged them to be brave, to ride horses, to climb trees, to test themselves. But Alice was not included in the same way. She was older than the others, and she was a girl, and there was something else, an unspoken awareness that she did not quite belong. Edith was not cruel. She was cold. She corrected Alice's posture, her manners, and her tendency to interrupt. She did not embrace her. She did not read to her before bed. She made certain Alice understood the rules of the house and the expectations placed on her, and she enforced them without affection. Alice was fed at the same table, dressed in similar clothes, tutored alongside her half-siblings. But she was not treated the same. The boys were roughhoused with and praised for their boldness. Ethel, the younger daughter, was coddled. Alice was kept at a distance. Theodore tried occasionally. He took Alice riding. He brought her books. But he could not look at her for long without seeing his first wife, and he had trained himself not to look at his first wife. He never spoke about Alice Lee Roosevelt in Alice's presence. He never explained how her mother had died, or what her mother had been like, or why Alice carried her name. The silence was absolute. Alice learned not to ask. By the time she was 8 years old, Alice had developed a sharp tongue and a watchful temperament. She learned to entertain herself, to read alone, to mock the younger children when they annoyed her. She learned that affection was scarce and must be earned, and that even when earned, it might still be withheld. She learned that she was tolerated, not wanted. She also learned that her father was important. Theodore was moving through New York politics quickly, making a name, accumulating allies and enemies. People came to Sagamore Hill to speak with him, to ask for his support, to measure his ambitions. Alice watched. She noticed who deferred to her father and who did not. She noticed how power worked, how it was performed and recognized. She was not included in these conversations, but she listened from doorways and staircases, and she remembered. In 1895, Theodore was appointed police commissioner of New York City. The family moved to Manhattan for a time, though Sagamore Hill remained their primary residence. Alice was 11. She attended a private school for girls where she learned French, deportment, and the basics of literature and history. She was quick but not diligent. Her teachers noted that she was intelligent but difficult, prone to sarcasm, resistant to correction. Edith received these reports with thin-lipped disapproval. Theodore barely read them. Alice began to realize slowly that she occupied a strange position. She was Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, and that meant something in New York society. But she was not fully part of his family, and that also meant something. She was visible, but not beloved. She had a name, but not a place. The contradiction sharpened her. She learned to perform confidence, to mock before she could be mocked, to wound with words before she could be wounded. At 13, she asked her father directly why he never spoke about her mother. They were alone in his study, and she had decided the silence had lasted long enough. Theodore looked at her, and for a moment something flickered across his face, grief or anger, or both. Then he said, "I will not speak of your mother. Do not ask me again." He left the room. Alice did not ask again. The question remained, unanswered and unanswerable. Alice carried it with her, a weight that never lessened. She learned to live with it the way she learned to live with Edith's coldness and her father's distance. She learned that love was conditional, that family was a structure maintained by effort, not feeling, and that she would need to find her own way to be noticed. She began, even then, to cultivate a reputation. She dressed sharply. She spoke sharply. She made herself impossible to ignore because being ignored was worse than being disliked. By the time Theodore was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1897, Alice was 14 and had already learned the central lesson of her childhood. If you cannot be loved, you can still be necessary. The move to Washington in 1897 did not change Alice's position in the household. Theodore accepted the appointment as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President McKinley, and the family relocated to a rented house on N Street. Edith supervised the packing and the arrangement of furniture with her usual precision. Alice, now 13, was assigned a bedroom on the second floor, smaller than the one she had occupied at Sagamore Hill. She did not complain. Complaining produced nothing. Washington was hotter than New York, the summers thick and airless. The house had no relief from it. Alice spent her first weeks indoors reading novels Edith considered inappropriate, sensational stories about doomed romances and European decadence. When Edith discovered them, she removed them without discussion. Alice purchased new copies with her allowance and hid them under her mattress. She was learning that defiance required discretion. Theodore was rarely home. His position demanded long hours at the Navy Department, and when he was not there, he was meeting with officials, writing reports, or preparing for what he believed would be an inevitable war with Spain. He had no patience for domesticity. He kissed Edith in the mornings and ignored Alice unless she placed herself directly in his path. Even then, his attention was brief. He would ask if she was studying, if she was behaving, and then he would leave before she answered. Edith organized the household with military efficiency. Meals were served at precise times. The younger children, Teddy, Kermit, Ethel, Archibald, were tutored in the mornings and allowed structured play in the afternoons. Alice was expected to participate in lessons, though her tutor found her inattentive. She was 14, too old to be managed like a child, too young to be left unsupervised. Edith watched her carefully, correcting her posture at the dinner table, her tone when speaking to the younger children, her tendency to read when she should be practicing piano. Alice hated the piano. She had no talent for it and no interest in developing one. But Edith insisted that a young woman of her position must be able to perform at social gatherings, and so Alice sat at the instrument twice a week, playing scales with deliberate slowness. The tutor, a thin woman with graying hair, would sigh and repeat instructions Alice had no intention of following. When Edith was out of the house, Alice stopped practicing entirely. The younger children were louder in Washington than they had been at Sagamore Hill. Teddy and Kermit wrestled in the hallways. Ethel cried frequently, demanding attention. Archibald, still a toddler, required constant supervision. The house was full of noise, and Alice moved through it like a ghost. She was present but not included, visible but not seen. The younger children did not seek her out. They had each other, and they had Edith, who doted on them in ways she never doted on Alice. Theodore's work consumed him. In early 1898, tensions with Spain escalated. The USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor in February, killing 266 men. Theodore argued for immediate military intervention. He attended meetings at the White House, at the War Department, at private gatherings where strategy was debated late into the night. He came home restless and distracted, pacing the halls, speaking to Edith in low tones about matters Alice could not fully hear. In April, war was declared. Theodore resigned from the Navy Department within days and accepted a commission as lieutenant colonel in the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, later known as the Rough Riders. Edith was furious. She did not argue loudly. She never argued loudly, but Alice could hear the sharpness in her voice through closed doors. Theodore would not be dissuaded. He left for training in Texas in May, and the house became quieter, smaller, emptier. Alice watched her father leave with something close to envy. He was escaping, and she could not. Edith's control over the household tightened in his absence. Rules became stricter. The children were not allowed to run indoors. Alice was forbidden from leaving the house unchaperoned. Edith hired a governess to oversee Alice specifically, a stern woman named Miss Young who accompanied her on walks and reported any deviation from acceptable behavior. Alice tested the boundaries immediately. She walked too quickly, forcing Miss Young to struggle to keep pace. She spoke to strangers on the street, young men who tipped their hats and smiled. Miss Young reported this to Edith, who restricted Alice's outings to the garden. Alice responded by climbing the garden wall and sitting on top of it, her legs dangling over the side, visible to passers-by. Edith saw her from the window and ordered her down. Alice complied slowly, taking her time. The war lasted 4 months. Theodore fought in Cuba, led the charge up San Juan Hill, and returned a national hero. The newspapers published his photograph, described his bravery, called him a man of action. He arrived back in Washington in August, thinner and sun-darkened, and the household erupted in celebration. The younger children clung to him. Edith wept briefly and then composed herself. Alice stood in the doorway and watched. Theodore barely glanced at her. He was too busy recounting his experiences, showing the children souvenirs he had brought back, describing the heat and the fighting, and the men who had died beside him. Alice listened from the edge of the room. She understood even then that her father needed an audience more than he needed a family. He needed to be admired, and the younger children provided that without complication. Alice did not. By the end of 1898, Theodore was being discussed as a candidate for governor of New York. Political allies visited the house frequently, assessing his viability, offering support. Theodore accepted the nomination and won the election in November. The family would return to New York. Alice was 15. The move back to New York did not feel like a return. The governor's residence in Albany was unfamiliar, colder than Washington, more formal. Edith decorated it with the same efficiency she had applied to every other house. Alice was given a room on the 3rd floor again, away from the family. She unpacked her belongings, books, a few dresses, a photograph of Mamie she kept hidden in a drawer, and understood that nothing had changed. Theodore was governor now, more important than before, more absent. He worked long hours, gave speeches, entertained political figures who came to assess his positions and his ambitions. Alice was introduced at dinners occasionally, when her presence was required for appearances. She learned to smile politely, to answer questions without saying anything memorable, to withdraw when dismissed. She learned that she was ornamental. Edith's coldness had calcified into routine. She no longer corrected Alice as often, she simply ignored her unless Alice's behavior threatened embarrassment. Alice understood this as a form of freedom. If she was not watched closely, she could not be controlled completely. She began to push further. Theodore Roosevelt became President of the United States on September 14, 1901, 6 days after an anarchist shot William McKinley at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo. McKinley died of gangrene. Theodore, who had been vice president for less than a year, took the oath of office in a private home, his hand on a borrowed Bible. He was 42 years old, the youngest man to ever hold the office. Alice was 17. The family moved into the White House within weeks. Edith oversaw the relocation with her usual control, directing staff, selecting which furniture would be brought from Sagamore Hill, and deciding which rooms each child would occupy. Alice was given a bedroom on the 2nd floor, near Ethel's. It had a view of Pennsylvania Avenue and thin curtains that did not block the morning light. She did not complain. She was learning to take what she could get. The White House was immediately chaotic. The younger children treated it like an extension of Sagamore Hill, running through hallways, sliding down banisters, keeping pets that wandered freely. Quentin, the youngest, brought his pony indoors once, leading it into an elevator to visit Archie, who was sick upstairs. The staff was horrified. Theodore laughed. Edith pursed her lips and said nothing. Alice was too old for such performances. At 17, she was expected to behave as the president's daughter, which meant appearing at state dinners, greeting foreign dignitaries, standing beside her father for photographs. She was tall now, with sharp features and her mother's pale blue eyes. Photographers liked her. She was striking, not beautiful, but that worked in her favor. The newspapers began writing about her almost immediately. They called her Princess Alice. She hated the nickname, but understood its value. Attention was currency, and she had learned that being ignored was worse than being misunderstood. She began cultivating a persona deliberately, dressing in colors Edith disapproved of, smoking cigarettes on the White House roof, placing bets at racetracks with men twice her age. The newspapers loved it. Edith did not. In January 1902, Alice attended her first state dinner. She wore a white gown Edith had selected, stood in a receiving line for 2 hours, smiled until her face ached. Foreign ambassadors bowed to her. Senators introduced themselves and their sons. Alice spoke politely and remembered none of their names. Afterward, Edith told her she had fidgeted too much and must learn to stand still. Alice said nothing. The attention increased. Photographers waited outside the White House gates, hoping to capture Alice leaving for an engagement or returning from a walk. She learned to pose without appearing to pose, tilting her head slightly, meeting the camera with a direct gaze that suggested confidence. The images appeared in newspapers across the country. Alice Roosevelt seen at the races. President's daughter attends opera opening. The headlines treated her like a public figure, and she began to behave like one. Theodore noticed, finally. He called her into his office one afternoon in March and told her that her behavior was becoming inappropriate. She was representing the presidency, he said, and she needed to understand the responsibility that entailed. Alice asked what specifically she had done wrong. Theodore listed her offenses: smoking in public, attending racetracks unchaperoned, staying out past midnight at parties. Alice pointed out that young men did all of these things without consequence. Theodore said she was not a young man. The conversation ended. Alice did not stop. She attended more parties, drank champagne in private rooms, and let young men light her cigarettes. She carried a pet snake named Emily Spinach to social events, draping it over her shoulders to unsettle the wives of cabinet members. The snake became famous. Newspapers ran cartoons of Alice with the snake coiled around her arm. Theodore received letters from concerned citizens urging him to control his daughter. He showed them to Edith, who showed them to Alice. Alice smiled and said nothing. The defiance was not aimless. Alice understood that she had no real power. She could not vote, could not hold office, could not make decisions that mattered. But she could be noticed. She could create spectacle. She could make people talk about her, and in doing so make herself indispensable to the narrative of Theodore's presidency. She was performing rebellion, and the performance worked. In the summer of 1902, Alice traveled to Newport for the social season. She stayed with family friends, attended yacht parties, danced with sons of industrialists and railroad magnates. The young men competed for her attention, not because they loved her, but because she was Theodore Roosevelt's daughter. Alice understood this clearly. She flirted without commitment, accepted invitations without promises, kept herself just out of reach. It was a game, and she was better at it than they were. One young man, a banker's son named Arthur Iselin, proposed marriage in August. They were standing on a terrace overlooking the ocean, and he had clearly rehearsed his speech. Alice let him finish, then told him no. He asked why. She said she did not love him. He said love could develop. Alice said it could, but it would not. He looked wounded. Alice left the terrace. She returned to Washington in September with no engagement and no regrets. Edith asked if she had received any serious proposals. Alice said she had. Edith asked why she had refused them. Alice said the men were boring. Edith said marriage was not about excitement. Alice said perhaps it should be. The conversation ended. Theodore's presidency was consuming him. He was trust-busting, negotiating treaties, positioning himself for re-election in 1904. He had little time for domestic concerns. Alice's behavior was a distraction he could not afford to manage personally, so he delegated the task to Edith, who had already given up. Alice was permitted to do as she pleased as long as she avoided outright scandal. In 1903, Alice was invited to christen a new yacht in New York. She arrived wearing a blue dress and a hat with an oversized feather. The crowd cheered when she broke the champagne bottle against the hull. Photographers captured the moment. The image appeared in newspapers the next day. Alice clipped it and kept it in her desk drawer. She was 19 years old and more famous than most of her father's cabinet. She attended the theater frequently, sitting in private boxes with friends whose parents were wealthy and indulgent. She went to horse races in Maryland, betting small amounts and losing without concern. She smoked in carriages, drank wine at dinners, and stayed out until 2 in the morning. The newspapers called her reckless. Theodore called her difficult. Alice called herself free, but the freedom was limited. She had no income of her own, no independence beyond what Theodore allowed. She lived in the White House, wore dresses purchased with her father's money, attended events because she was invited as Theodore Roosevelt's daughter. The rebellion was tolerated because it was contained. Alice understood this, even as she performed otherwise. In July 1905, Alice was informed that she would be joining a congressional delegation to Asia. The trip was diplomatic, a goodwill tour designed to strengthen American relations with Japan, Korea, the Philippines, and China. William Howard Taft, the Secretary of War, would lead the delegation. Alice would serve as the official hostess, representing her father in a ceremonial capacity. She was 21 years old and had never left the continent. Theodore presented the opportunity as an honor. Alice understood it as an exile. She had been too visible in Washington, too uncontrollable. The newspapers had started asking questions about why the president's daughter remained unmarried, why she showed no interest in settling down. Theodore wanted her occupied, and preferably far away. Alice accepted the assignment without argument. Refusing would have accomplished nothing. The delegation departed from San Francisco in early July aboard the steamship SS Manchuria. Alice shared a cabin with Edith Root, the daughter of the Secretary of State, and Amy McMillan, whose father was a senator. The three young women were expected to attend dinners, smile during toasts, and represent American grace. Alice found the arrangement tedious but tolerable. At least she was not in Washington. The voyage took 3 weeks. Alice spent the days reading on deck, playing cards with junior congressmen, and avoiding the official receptions Taft hosted in the ship's dining room. She attended when required, but left as soon as politeness allowed. Taft noticed her absences and mentioned them to Theodore in a letter. Theodore wrote back instructing Taft to let Alice do as she pleased, provided she caused no incidents. Taft complied. Nicholas Longworth was part of the delegation. He was a congressman from Ohio, 36 years old, balding, shorter than Alice, and unremarkable in appearance. He played the violin competently and told jokes that were mildly amusing. Alice had met him briefly in Washington and had not thought of him again. On the ship, he sought her out. They spoke on deck one evening while the others were at dinner. Nicholas asked if she was enjoying the voyage. Alice said she was not enjoying it, but did not mind it. He laughed at that, a soft sound that suggested he understood the distinction. They talked for an hour, about nothing in particular. Books they had read, cities they had visited, the absurdity of diplomatic protocol. Alice found him tolerable. He did not try to impress her, which impressed her. Nicholas began sitting near her at meals. He brought her tea in the afternoons. He asked her opinions on small matters, whether the weather would hold, whether the dinner menu was adequate, and listened to her answers without correcting her. Alice appreciated this. Most men either ignored her or lectured her. Nicholas did neither. By the time the ship reached Yokohama in late July, they were spending several hours a day together. Alice did not love him. She was not certain she liked him, but he was present, attentive, and unmarried. He was also 15 years older, which meant he was established, settled, unlikely to make demands she could not meet. Alice began to consider him as a possibility. Japan overwhelmed her. The heat was oppressive, the crowds enormous, the ceremonies endless. She was introduced to Emperor Meiji, toured temples, attended banquets where she could not eat the food. The Japanese press was fascinated by her. They called her the American princess and published sketches of her in newspapers. Alice smiled through all of it, her face aching, her feet blistering in shoes that had not been designed for walking. Nicholas stayed close. He translated when necessary, though his Japanese was poor. He offered his arm when they walked through crowded streets. He shielded her from the more aggressive reporters. Alice noticed all of this. She noticed also that he drank more than he should, that his laugh became louder and less genuine as the evenings wore on, that he watched her in ways that suggested calculation, not affection. In Korea, the delegation was received by the Emperor Gojong, who gave Alice a small embroidered box. She accepted it politely, though she found it ugly. Nicholas asked if she liked it. Alice said no. He laughed and said he would have lied. Alice said lying was exhausting. Nicholas said it was necessary. Alice did not disagree. They arrived in the Philippines in September. The heat was worse than Japan, the humidity suffocating. Alice attended a reception at the Governor General's residence, where she stood for 3 hours in a gown that clung to her skin. Nicholas found her afterward, sitting alone on a terrace, fanning herself with a folded program. He asked if she wanted to leave the delegation early and return to the ship. Alice said yes. They left without informing anyone. On the ship, they sat on the deck in the dark. Nicholas offered her a cigarette. Alice accepted. They smoked in silence for several minutes. Then Nicholas said he intended to ask her father for permission to marry her. Alice looked at him. She did not ask if he loved her. She asked if he understood what marrying her would require. Nicholas said he understood that she was Theodore Roosevelt's daughter and that she would never be anonymous. Alice said that was not what she meant. Nicholas asked what she did mean. Alice said nothing. In China, the delegation toured the Forbidden City. Alice walked through empty courtyards past carved stone lions and faded red walls. The place felt abandoned, even with guards standing at intervals. Nicholas walked beside her, quieter than usual. He asked if she had considered his proposal. Alice said she had not decided. He asked what would help her decide. Alice said time. Nicholas said they did not have much time. The delegation would return to San Francisco in October. Alice said she was aware. By the time the ship left Shanghai, Alice had made her decision. She told Nicholas on the deck late at night when the others were asleep. She said she would marry him if her father approved. Nicholas asked why she had agreed. Alice said because it was practical. Nicholas looked disappointed, but did not argue. They shook hands. Alice went to her cabin and did not sleep. The return voyage was longer than the outbound journey. Storms delayed them twice. Alice spent the days reading and avoiding Nicholas, who seemed uncertain how to behave now that the matter was settled. He brought her tea. She accepted it. He asked if she was happy. Alice said happiness was not the point. Nicholas did not ask what the point was. They arrived in San Francisco in late October. Theodore was waiting. He had received Nicholas's letter weeks earlier and had already given his approval. Alice learned this from Edith, who told her in the hotel where they were staying. Edith said the wedding would take place in February. Alice said that was fine. The engagement was announced in November 1905. The newspapers treated it as a national event. Princess Alice to wed Congressman Longworth ran in headlines from New York to California. Photographs of Nicholas appeared beside photographs of Alice, the contrast between them immediately apparent. She was tall and sharp-featured, he short and soft around the middle. The editorials praised the match as sensible. Nicholas was respectable, accomplished, from a prominent Ohio family. Alice was 21 and had delayed marriage long enough. Theodore approved publicly and expressed reservations privately. He told Edith that Nicholas drank too much and lacked ambition beyond maintaining his congressional seat. Edith said Alice could have done worse. Theodore did not argue. He wrote to Alice saying he hoped she would be happy, though the letter read more like a formality than a sentiment. Alice kept it in a drawer and did not respond. The wedding was scheduled for February 17, 1906 at the White House. Edith took control of the planning immediately. She selected the flowers, the menu, the guest list. Alice was consulted on her dress and nothing else. The dress was white satin with a long train, designed by a dressmaker in New York who had dressed Alice before. Alice stood for fittings without interest. The dressmaker asked if she wanted any alterations. Alice said it was fine as it was. Nicholas visited Washington twice before the wedding. He stayed at a hotel near the White House and called on Alice each afternoon. They took walks through the grounds, chaperoned by one of Edith's staff. Nicholas talked about his work in Congress, his family's home in Cincinnati, his plans to continue serving Ohio's 1st District. Alice listened without commenting. He asked once if she loved him. Alice said she respected him. Nicholas said that was enough. Alice did not correct him. In January, gifts began arriving. Silver trays, porcelain vases, embroidered linens, checks from relatives Alice had never met. Edith cataloged each item in a ledger, writing thank you notes in Alice's name. Alice was shown the gifts once, spread across a table in the East Room. She looked at them for less than a minute. Edith asked if she was pleased. Alice said they were generous. Edith said Alice should write personal notes to the most important donors. Alice said Edith's notes would be better received. Edith did not disagree. The wedding took place at noon. Nearly 1,000 guests filled the East Room. Alice walked down the makeshift aisle on Theodore's arm. He smiled for the cameras but said nothing to her. Nicholas waited at the front, his hands clasped, his expression nervous. The ceremony lasted 20 minutes. Alice repeated her vows clearly, without hesitation. Nicholas's voice shook. When the officiant pronounced them married, Nicholas kissed Alice briefly. The room applauded. The reception was held in the state dining room. Tables were covered with white cloths, centerpieces of roses and lilies. Alice and Nicholas stood in a receiving line for 2 hours, shaking hands, accepting congratulations. Alice's face ached from smiling. Nicholas drank 3 glasses of champagne in the first hour. By the time they cut the cake, a towering structure decorated with spun sugar, he was unsteady. Alice noticed. So did Theodore, who pulled Nicholas aside afterward and spoke to him quietly. Nicholas nodded, pale. He drank water for the rest of the afternoon. The wedding gifts were displayed in an adjacent room. Guests wandered through, admiring the silver and crystal. Alice avoided the room entirely. She stood near a window, watching the photographers outside on the lawn. Edith approached and told her she needed to mingle. Alice said she was tired. Edith said exhaustion was not an excuse. Alice returned to the reception. The honeymoon began the next day. Nicholas had planned a tour of Europe: England, France, Germany, Italy. They sailed from New York on a steamship that was smaller and less comfortable than the Manchuria. Alice and Nicholas shared a cabin. The first night, Nicholas attempted intimacy. Alice submitted without enthusiasm. Afterward, Nicholas asked if she was all right. Alice said she was fine. Nicholas fell asleep. Alice stared at the ceiling. England was cold and wet. They stayed in London for a week, attending theater performances and dinners hosted by minor aristocrats who were curious about Theodore Roosevelt's daughter. Alice found the English condescending. They asked questions about American politics with thinly veiled amusement, as though the United States were a child nation still learning to govern itself. Alice answered politely and hated every word. Nicholas was deferential in these settings. He laughed at jokes Alice did not find funny. He agreed with opinions Alice found absurd. He drank port after dinner and became louder, more animated, and less careful. Alice watched him perform and understood that he needed approval in ways she did not. She found it weak. In France, they visited Paris. Nicholas wanted to see museums. Alice wanted to walk along the Seine and be left alone. They compromised by doing both, though neither enjoyed the other's preference. Nicholas talked constantly, narrating paintings, recounting historical facts he had read in guidebooks. Alice stopped listening. She looked at the art and thought about nothing. They argued for the first time in a hotel room in Paris. Nicholas had returned late from a dinner with American expatriates, drunk and unsteady. Alice was awake, reading. Nicholas asked why she had not accompanied him. Alice said she had not been invited. Nicholas said she could have come anyway. Alice said she had no interest in spending an evening with strangers. Nicholas said she was cold. Alice did not deny it. Nicholas sat on the bed and put his head in his hands. Alice continued reading. Germany was worse. They stayed in Berlin, where Nicholas had business contacts he wanted to impress. He arranged dinners, introduced Alice as the president's daughter, and used her presence to elevate his own standing. Alice understood what was happening and resented it. She attended the dinners, smiled, spoke when addressed, and said nothing of substance. Nicholas thanked her afterward. Alice did not respond. In Italy, they stayed in Rome for 2 weeks. Nicholas wanted to see the ruins, the Vatican, the forums. Alice accompanied him without complaint, though she found the heat unbearable and the crowds exhausting. They visited the Colosseum on a Tuesday afternoon. Nicholas stood in the center looking up at the broken walls and said something about the impermanence of empires. Alice said nothing. She was thinking about the White House, about Washington, about the fact that she would return as Nicholas Longworth's wife and no longer as Alice Roosevelt. They sailed back to New York in May. The ship was crowded, the crossing rough. Alice spent most of the voyage in the cabin, reading and avoiding Nicholas. He knocked once, asked if she wanted company. Alice said no. Nicholas left. When they arrived in New York, reporters were waiting. Nicholas smiled and waved. Alice stood beside him, silent. Nicholas and Alice moved into a house on M Street in Washington in June 1906. The house was narrow, 3 stories, unremarkable. It had belonged to Nicholas's aunt, who had died the previous year and left it to him in her will. The furniture was outdated, the wallpaper faded. Alice walked through the rooms on her first day and felt nothing. Nicholas asked if she wanted to redecorate. Alice said it did not matter. Nicholas hired decorators anyway. The house was meant to be temporary. Nicholas spoke often about purchasing a larger home, something appropriate for a congressman with ambitions. He wanted a place where they could entertain, where Alice could host dinners for influential members of Congress and their wives. Alice said she had no interest in hosting dinners. Nicholas said it was expected. Alice said many things were expected. The conversation ended. Nicholas returned to Congress that fall. He left the house early each morning and returned late in the evening, often smelling of whiskey. He claimed the drinking was social, necessary for building alliances. Alice did not argue. She spent her days reading, walking through the city alone, visiting friends who were also young wives trapped in similar arrangements. They drank tea and complained about their husbands in careful language, never stating anything directly. By the end of 1906, Alice had not conceived. Edith wrote asking if there was news. Alice wrote back saying there was not. Edith's next letter contained the name of a doctor in Washington who specialized in women's ailments. Alice visited the doctor in January 1907. He examined her, asked intrusive questions about her marriage, and concluded that there was no obvious impediment to conception. He suggested she relax. Alice asked how one relaxed on command. The doctor did not answer. Nicholas wanted children. He mentioned it frequently, in ways that felt like accusations. He would see a child on the street and comment on how pleasant it must be to have a family. He would visit colleagues whose wives had recently given birth and return home speaking about the importance of legacy. Alice understood what he was implying. She said nothing. In the spring of 1907, Alice began experiencing severe headaches. They arrived without warning, sharp pains behind her eyes that lasted for hours. She consulted the same doctor who had examined her before. He suggested the headaches were nervous in origin, related to stress or unhappiness. He prescribed rest and fresh air. Alice asked if he had a prescription for unhappiness. The doctor said she was being difficult. Nicholas's drinking worsened. He came home drunk 3 nights a week, then 4, then 5. He was not violent, only loud and maudlin. He would sit in the parlor and talk about his father, who had been a prominent judge, and about his own failures to live up to the family name. Alice would listen from the hallway, unwilling to engage. When Nicholas called for her, she would enter the room, stand near the door, and wait for him to finish. Then she would help him upstairs to bed. The marriage became a performance. They attended social events together, smiled for photographers, and played the role of a successful political couple. At home, they barely spoke. Nicholas spent his evenings drinking. Alice spent hers reading or writing letters to friends in New York. She told them nothing truthful. She described parties, mentioned Nicholas's work in Congress, and signed her name. The letters were hollow, but they passed the time. In 1908, Theodore chose not to run for re-election. He supported William Howard Taft, his Secretary of War, who won the presidency in November. The transition meant the end of Alice's status as the president's daughter. She was now simply Nicholas Longworth's wife, a congressman's spouse with no independent identity. The newspapers stopped writing about her. Invitations decreased. Alice noticed and did not care. Nicholas ran for re-election in 1908 and lost. The defeat shocked him. He had held his seat for 8 years and believed it was secure. The loss was narrow, but it was final. He returned to Washington after the election and began drinking immediately. He drank for 3 days without stopping. Alice watched him and said nothing. On the 4th day, he sobered up and announced they would move to Cincinnati. Alice said fine. Cincinnati was smaller than Washington, quieter, less interesting. They lived in the Longworth family home, a large house on a hill overlooking the city. Nicholas's mother still lived there, a severe woman in her 70s who disapproved of Alice immediately. She criticized Alice's wardrobe, her lack of domestic skills, her failure to produce grandchildren. Alice tolerated the criticism in silence. Nicholas did nothing to defend her. Nicholas practiced law in Cincinnati, though he had no passion for it. He spent his days in an office downtown, handling contracts and minor disputes. He spoke often about returning to Congress, about running again in 1910. Alice said nothing. She spent her days in the Longworth house, avoiding Nicholas's mother, reading in a second-floor room that faced the garden. In 1909, Alice returned to Washington for a visit. She stayed with friends, attended a few dinners, saw the city she had left. Everything felt smaller. The people she had known were older, grayer, less vital. Theodore had left office and moved back to Sagamore Hill. The White House was occupied by Taft, who was already struggling. Alice returned to Cincinnati after a week, feeling worse than when she had left. Nicholas ran for Congress again in 1910 and won. They moved back to Washington in early 1911, renting a different house, larger than the first. Alice furnished it without enthusiasm. Nicholas resumed his old routines, Congress during the day, drinking in the evenings. Alice resumed hers, reading, walking, avoiding her husband. The question of children persisted. Alice visited another doctor in 1911, a specialist who examined her more thoroughly, and concluded that conception was unlikely, but not impossible. He did not explain why. Alice asked for specifics. The doctor said the female body was mysterious. Alice left his office and did not return. Nicholas stopped mentioning children directly, but the omission was its own accusation. His mother wrote letters asking when Alice would fulfill her duty. Edith wrote less frequently, but with the same implication. Alice responded to none of them. She understood that her failure to conceive had become her defining characteristic in their eyes. She was a wife who could not produce children, and therefore a wife who had failed. By 1912, Alice and Nicholas had been married for 6 years. They had no children, no affection, no shared goals. They lived in the same house and occupied separate lives. Nicholas drank. Alice read. They attended events together when necessary and avoided each other when possible. The marriage had become what Alice had always suspected it would be, a structure maintained for appearances, empty at its center. William Borah arrived in Washington in 1907 as a newly elected senator from Idaho. He was 42 years old, tall, with thick gray hair and a voice that carried across crowded rooms. He had built his reputation as a prosecutor in Idaho, arguing cases with a theatricality that juries found persuasive. In the Senate, he positioned himself as a progressive Republican, opposing Taft's policies and aligning himself with Theodore Roosevelt's reformist faction. Alice met him at a dinner in 1912. The dinner was held at the home of a mutual acquaintance, a senator's wife who collected political figures the way others collected art. Alice attended because Nicholas insisted. He was trying to rebuild alliances after his years out of Congress, and he needed Alice beside him to signal stability. Alice wore a dark blue dress and spoke to no one unless addressed directly. Borah sat across from her at the table. He asked her opinion on a recent tariff bill. Alice was surprised. Most men at such dinners did not ask her opinions. They stated their own and expected agreement. She told him the bill was poorly constructed and would benefit manufacturers at the expense of consumers. Borah smiled and said he had voted against it for the same reason. They spoke for the rest of the dinner, ignoring the others at the table. Nicholas noticed but said nothing. Borah began appearing at events Alice attended. He would find her in crowded rooms, stand near her at receptions, sit beside her at dinners when the seating allowed. He did not flirt in obvious ways. He spoke to her as though her thoughts mattered, asked questions and waited for answers, disagreed with her when he believed she was wrong. Alice found this unusual. Most men either dismissed her or deferred to her because of her father. Borah did neither. In the spring of 1912, Theodore Roosevelt announced he would challenge Taft for the Republican nomination. The party split immediately. Taft's supporters controlled the machinery, but Theodore had popular support and the energy of the progressive wing. Borah sided with Theodore publicly, giving speeches across the country, attacking Taft's conservatism. Nicholas, who owed his congressional seat to Taft's coattails, remained neutral and therefore irrelevant. Alice sided with her father, as expected, but her support was personal, not strategic. She wanted Theodore back in power because it would restore her proximity to influence. Theodore lost the nomination at the Republican convention in June. The process was bitter, marked by accusations of delegate theft and procedural manipulation. Theodore walked out and formed the Progressive Party, declaring he would run as a third-party candidate. Borah refused to follow him. He believed leaving the Republican Party was political suicide and told Theodore so directly. Alice admired the refusal. Borah was willing to oppose her father when he believed Theodore was wrong. Nicholas would never have done that. Alice and Borah began meeting privately. The first time was an accident. They encountered each other at the Library of Congress in July, both researching different topics. They spoke for an hour in the reading room, their voices low. Afterward, Borah suggested they continue the conversation over lunch. Alice agreed. They ate at a small restaurant where neither of them would be recognized. The lunch lasted 3 hours. The affair began in August. Bora invited Alice to his office in the Senate building under the pretense of discussing a letter she wanted delivered to her father. Nicholas was in Cincinnati visiting his mother. Alice arrived in the late afternoon. Bora closed the door. They did not discuss the letter. Afterward, Alice left through a side entrance and walked back to her house alone. She felt nothing resembling guilt. The affair continued throughout the fall. They met in Bora's office in borrowed apartments, once in a hotel in Baltimore, when both claimed to be visiting elsewhere. They were careful. Bora had a wife, Mary, who lived with him in Washington, but rarely accompanied him to social events. She was ill frequently, confined to their home, uninterested in politics. Alice never asked about her. Bora never mentioned her unless necessary. Nicholas knew, or suspected. Alice did not hide her absences carefully, and Nicholas was not stupid. But he said nothing. Confronting Alice would require acknowledging the failure of their marriage, and Nicholas preferred pretending the marriage was intact. He drank more, stayed out later, and returned home long after Alice was asleep. They maintained the performance in public and avoided each other in private. Theodore lost the 1912 election. Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic candidate, won easily. Theodore carried 6 states, Taft carried 2, the Republican Party was destroyed, and Theodore's political career was finished. He returned to Sagamore Hill in defeat, bitter and exhausted. Alice visited him once in early 1913. He looked older, grayer, diminished. He spoke about writing, about travel, about anything except politics. Alice stayed for 2 hours and left feeling worse than when she arrived. Bora's marriage to Alice was not romantic. It was not tender. It was a transaction, though neither of them named it as such. Bora needed discretion, and Alice needed someone who treated her as though she mattered. They met when they could, spoke when it was safe, and maintained separate lives the rest of the time. The arrangement suited them both. In 1914, war broke out in Europe. Bora opposed American involvement, arguing that the conflict was not America's concern. Theodore recovered somewhat from his defeat, began advocating for preparedness, convinced that America would eventually be drawn in. The disagreement between Bora and Theodore became public. Alice found herself caught between them, agreeing with her father but sleeping with a man who opposed him. She resolved the contradiction by ignoring it. Nicholas ran for re-election in 1914 and won again. His seat was now secure, his position stable. He chaired minor committees, gave unremarkable speeches, and drank with colleagues. He was competent but forgettable. Alice accompanied him to events when required and disappeared when she could. Their marriage had settled into a routine of mutual neglect. Bora's wife, Mary, grew sicker. She rarely left their home, suffering from ailments the doctors could not diagnose or treat. Bora stayed married to her out of obligation or guilt or both. Alice never asked him to leave Mary. Marriage was not what Alice wanted. She wanted someone who spoke to her as though she had a mind, and Bora provided that. The rest, affection, permanence, public acknowledgement, was irrelevant. By 1916, the affair had lasted 4 years. It would last decades more. Alice and Bora settled into a pattern that neither of them questioned. They met when possible, avoided scandal, and maintained the structures of their separate lives. Nicholas drank. Mary stayed home. Alice and Bora continued. No one spoke about it directly, and so it was never addressed. The silence became its own kind of permission. Alice realized she was pregnant in late 1924. She was 40 years old. She had not conceived in 18 years of marriage to Nicholas, and the doctors she had consulted over the years had concluded that she likely never would. The pregnancy was unexpected, unwanted, and undeniably Bora's. Nicholas had been sleeping in a separate bedroom for years and rarely touched her. The timing made the paternity obvious to anyone who cared to calculate. Alice told Nicholas in December. They were in the parlor of their house on M Street. Nicholas was reading the newspaper. Alice said she was pregnant. Nicholas looked at her for a long moment, then folded the newspaper and set it aside. He asked if she was certain. Alice said the doctor had confirmed it. Nicholas asked if the child was his. Alice did not answer. Nicholas nodded slowly, poured himself a drink, and said they would announce it after the new year. He did not ask whose child it was. He did not need to. The announcement appeared in the newspapers in January 1925. Mrs. Nicholas Longworth expecting first child. The stories noted Alice's age and the length of her marriage, treating the pregnancy as a minor miracle. Friends wrote letters of congratulation. Edith sent a brief note saying she was pleased. Theodore had died in 1919, so Alice did not have to endure his reaction. She was grateful for that, at least. Bora learned of the pregnancy from the newspapers. He did not contact Alice directly. He could not, without risking exposure. Alice did not contact him either. They had never discussed the possibility of children. They had been careful, or believed they were being careful, but clearly something had failed. Alice did not consider ending the pregnancy. Abortion was dangerous, illegal, and morally complicated in ways she did not want to examine. She would carry the child and deliver it and deal with the consequences. The pregnancy was difficult. Alice was nauseous for months, unable to eat without discomfort. She gained weight slowly, her body resisting the process. The doctors monitored her closely, concerned about her age. Women over 40 rarely carried pregnancies to term, and complications were common. Alice endured the examinations, the warnings, the unsolicited advice. She spent most of the pregnancy indoors, avoiding public appearances. Nicholas maintained the fiction of paternity. He told colleagues he was delighted. He accepted congratulations. He ordered cigars to distribute after the birth. Alice watched him perform and said nothing. The performance was necessary. If Nicholas acknowledged the child was not his, the scandal would destroy them both. Alice's reputation would be ruined. Nicholas's political career ended and Bora's marriage exposed. The lie protected everyone. Alice went into labor on February 14, 1925. The timing was cruelly appropriate. Her 41st birthday, the anniversary of her mother's death. The labor lasted 18 hours. The doctor was present along with a nurse and a midwife Nicholas had insisted on hiring. Alice refused anesthesia, wanting to remain conscious. The pain was extraordinary, worse than anything she had anticipated. She did not scream. She breathed through it, gripping the bed frame until her hands ached. The child was born just before dawn on February 15th. A girl. Alice heard the baby cry and felt nothing. The doctor cleaned the infant, wrapped her in a blanket, and placed her in Alice's arms. Alice looked at the child, red-faced, squinting, impossibly small, and felt only exhaustion. The nurse asked if she wanted to try feeding her. Alice said no. The nurse took the baby away. Nicholas came into the room an hour later. He asked if Alice was all right. Alice said she was tired. Nicholas asked if he could see the child. Alice said the nurse had her. Nicholas left. Alice closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep would not come. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about her own mother who had died 2 days after giving birth. Alice had survived. She did not know if that was better. They named the child Paulina. It was Nicholas's choice. Alice had no preference. She stayed in bed for 2 weeks, recovering slowly. The baby was cared for by a nurse Nicholas had hired, a sturdy woman from Ohio who had raised 6 children of her own. Alice saw Paulina only when the nurse brought her in for feeding. Alice attempted to nurse but found it painful and unpleasant. After a week, she switched to bottle feeding. The nurse took over entirely. The newspapers published photographs of Nicholas holding Paulina. Congressman Longworth and daughter. Nicholas smiled for the cameras, his expression proud. Alice was not in the photographs. She had refused to pose, citing exhaustion. The newspapers noted her absence, but did not press. New mothers were expected to rest, and Alice was over 40. The public extended her grace more than usual. Bora never acknowledged the child. He could not. He and Alice did not speak about Paulina directly, even in private. When they resumed their affair, months after the birth, they avoided the topic entirely. Bora asked once if Alice was well. Alice said she was managing. Bora did not ask again. The child existed, but only in the narrow space of Alice and Nicholas's marriage. Everywhere else, she was invisible. Paulina was a quiet baby. She cried rarely, slept for long stretches, and caused little disruption. The nurse managed her efficiently. Alice saw her in the mornings briefly, and sometimes in the evenings if Nicholas insisted. Alice held her when required, but did not seek her out. She did not feel the attachment other mothers described. She looked at Paulina and saw a complication, a consequence, a living reminder of choices she had made without fully considering their weight. Nicholas adored Paulina, or performed adoration convincingly. He hired photographers to take portraits. He showed the pictures to colleagues. He spoke about her in interviews, describing her as a blessing that had arrived late, but was all the more precious for it. Alice listened to him say these things and felt distant, as though he were describing someone else's child. By the time Paulina was 6 months old, Alice had resumed most of her social obligations. She attended dinners, hosted small gatherings, and maintained her position in Washington society. She left Paulina with the nurse and did not think about her, unless forced to. Nicholas encouraged this. He wanted Alice visible and wanted their marriage to appear stable. Paulina was evidence of that stability, but only if Alice participated in the performance. Alice participated minimally. The affair with Bora continued. They met less frequently now, both of them cautious, aware that scrutiny had increased. But they met. Alice needed the escape, the reminder that she was something other than Nicholas Longworth's wife or Paulina's mother. Bora needed Alice for reasons he never fully articulated, and Alice did not ask. They took what they needed from each other and returned to their separate lives. Paulina grew. She learned to sit, to crawl, to walk. Alice watched from a distance, present but not involved. Nicholas Longworth became Speaker of the House in 1925. The same year, Paulina was born. The position elevated him beyond what his abilities warranted, a product of seniority and political maneuvering rather than leadership. He was well liked by colleagues, affable when sober, harmless when drunk. The Speaker's role required him to preside over sessions, manage legislation, and represent the House publicly. Nicholas did this adequately, without distinction. Alice watched his rise with detachment. His success did not improve their marriage. The Speaker's residence came with the position, a larger house with more rooms and more staff. Alice oversaw the move in early 1926, directing workers, unpacking boxes, arranging furniture. Paulina, barely a year old, was kept upstairs with her nurse during the disruption. Nicholas was rarely present. He spent his days at the Capitol and his evenings at dinners or receptions. Alice attended when required but declined most invitations. She preferred staying home, reading, avoiding the performances that exhausted her. Nicholas's drinking worsened with the added responsibility. He had always been a heavy drinker, but the Speaker's role gave him more access and more excuses. He drank at luncheons, at committee meetings, at private gatherings in the Capitol. Colleagues noticed but said nothing. Washington tolerated drunkenness as long as it did not interfere with votes. Nicholas managed to show up when needed, cast the necessary votes, and keep the machinery running. That was enough. Alice and Nicholas barely spoke by 1927. They lived in the same house but occupied separate floors. Nicholas slept in a bedroom near his study. Alice kept her room on the opposite side of the house. Paulina stayed in the nursery with her nurse, a third life running parallel to theirs. They saw each other at breakfast occasionally, exchanged necessary information, and parted. The house was large enough to avoid each other entirely. Paulina was 2 years old, learning to speak in short, careful sentences. Alice saw her for brief periods each day, usually in the late afternoon when the nurse brought her downstairs. Paulina would sit on the floor with wooden blocks or a picture book while Alice read nearby. They did not interact much. Paulina seemed content with the nurse, a sturdy woman named Mrs. Crawford, who fed her, bathed her, and put her to bed each night. Alice paid Mrs. Crawford well and asked a few questions. In 1928, Nicholas ran for re-election as Speaker and won easily. The Republicans maintained control of the House, and Nicholas's colleagues saw no reason to replace him. He gave a brief speech after his re-election, thanking the members for their confidence. Alice was not present. She had stayed home with a headache, real or invented. Nicholas did not ask which. The affair with Bora continued, though less frequently now. Bora's wife, Mary, had died in 1926 after years of illness. Bora had not remarried. He was 61, still serving in the Senate, still opposed to foreign entanglements, still vocal in his isolationism. He and Alice met when they could in borrowed apartments or hotel rooms in cities where neither had official business. They spoke about politics, about books, about the failures of the current administration. They did not speak about Paulina. Bora never asked about her. Alice never mentioned her. By 1930, Nicholas's health was declining. He was 61 years old, overweight, his face flushed and bloated from decades of drinking. He had episodes of shortness of breath, chest pain that he dismissed as indigestion. Alice urged him to see a doctor. Nicholas refused. He said doctors were pessimists who made healthy men sick with worry. Alice stopped urging. In early April 1931, Nicholas collapsed during a session of the House. He was carried to his office, pale and sweating, his breathing shallow. A doctor was summoned. Nicholas was diagnosed with pneumonia, complicated by what the doctor suspected was heart disease. He was taken home and confined to bed. Alice directed the staff, ensured the doctor visited daily, and kept Paulina away from the sick room. Nicholas worsened over the next week. Alice sat with him once late at night when the house was quiet. Nicholas was awake but weak, his voice barely audible. He asked if Alice would stay with him. Alice said she would stay until he fell asleep. Nicholas asked if she had ever loved him. Alice did not answer immediately. Then she said she had respected him. Nicholas closed his eyes. He said that was more than he had expected. He fell asleep. Alice left the room. Nicholas Longworth died on April 9, 1931, at age 61. The cause was listed as pneumonia, though his heart had likely failed. The newspapers ran obituaries praising his service, his affability, and his long career in Congress. Alice was mentioned briefly as his widow. Paulina was not mentioned at all. The funeral was held at the Capitol. Nicholas lay in state in the rotunda, an honor reserved for speakers and other high officials. Thousands came to pay respects. Alice attended in black, her face veiled, Paulina beside her in a small black dress. The child was 6 years old, confused by the ceremony. Asking questions Alice did not answer. Mrs. Crawford held Paulina's hand and kept her quiet. After the funeral, Alice returned to the house on M Street. Nicholas's estate was settled quickly. He had left everything to Alice, the house, his savings, his investments. It was not a fortune, but it was enough. Alice had her own money as well, an inheritance from Theodore that had been managed carefully over the years. She was financially secure, more secure than she had been as Nicholas's wife. Alice did not grieve. She felt relief, followed by guilt about the relief, followed by acceptance of both. Nicholas had not been cruel, only weak. He had given her his name, his protection, a semblance of respectability. In return, she had given him the appearance of a marriage. The transaction was complete. She owed him nothing more. Bora sent a brief letter of condolence. It was formal, appropriate, signed only with his initials. Alice read it once and burned it. They did not see each other for several months after Nicholas's death. The scandal would have been too obvious. Alice understood this. She did not resent it. Their affair had always required discretion, and Nicholas's death did not change that. By the end of 1931, Alice had settled into widowhood. She kept the house, dismissed some of the staff, retained Mrs. Crawford to care for Paulina. She resumed hosting small dinners, inviting senators and journalists and anyone else whose company she found tolerable. The dinners became regular, then essential, then famous. Alice's salon was born not from ambition, but from boredom. She needed something to occupy her time, and politics was what she knew. The men came because she was Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, and because she was sharp, and because refusing her invitation was unwise. Alice did not care why they came. She only cared that they did. Alice's dinners began informally in 1932. She invited a few senators, a journalist or two, people she found tolerable. They gathered in her drawing room on M Street, ate modest meals prepared by her cook, and talked until late. Alice presided without appearing to preside. She asked questions, interrupted when the conversation grew dull, steered topics toward conflict. The guests enjoyed themselves. They returned. Word spread. By 1933, an invitation to Alice's home was considered valuable. She did not invite randomly. She selected guests carefully, senators who held important committee positions, journalists who wrote for influential papers, occasional cabinet members when they proved interesting. She excluded the boring, the sycophantic, and anyone who took themselves too seriously. Her criteria were unclear, which made the invitations more desirable. The conversations were not polite. Alice encouraged the argument. She seated political enemies beside each other, asked provocative questions, and watched the results. If someone made a weak point, she said so. If someone lied, she corrected them. The guests learned quickly that Alice's salon was not a place for careful diplomacy. It was a place where reputations could be damaged and alliances tested. They came anyway. Alice became a conduit for information. Senators told her things they would not say publicly. Journalists shared rumors they could not print. Alice listened, remembered, and used what she learned strategically. She did not leak information directly. That would have ended her usefulness. But she guided conversations, asked questions that revealed more than the speaker intended, and watched as people incriminated themselves without realizing it. She had no official power. She could not vote, could not introduce legislation, could not hold office. But she could influence those who did. A negative comment from Alice at the right moment, overheard by the right person, could end a nomination or derail a bill. She wielded this power carefully, never obviously, always with the appearance of casual conversation. The men who attended her dinners understood this. They feared her. Franklin Roosevelt became president in 1933. Alice hated him. He was a distant cousin through marriage, and she had known him for years. She found him arrogant, manipulative, and dangerously competent. His New Deal policies expanded government in ways she considered reckless. She mocked him openly, calling him a socialist, a tyrant, a cripple. Her cruelty toward his paralysis was deliberate and ugly. The newspapers reported her comments. Roosevelt ignored her publicly and resented her privately. Alice's relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt was worse. Eleanor had been Theodore's niece, Alice's first cousin, and the two women had known each other since childhood. Eleanor was earnest, idealistic, committed to social reform. Alice found her insufferable. She mocked Eleanor's voice, her appearance, her activism. She imitated her at parties, exaggerating her mannerisms until the room laughed. Eleanor heard about this and stopped speaking to Alice. Alice did not care. The salon continued throughout the 1930s. Alice hosted dinners twice a week, sometimes more. She never wrote invitations. She called people directly, told them when to arrive, and hung up. The guests came, senators brought information they wanted circulated, journalists brought gossip. Alice synthesized it all, shaping the flow of conversation so that everyone left knowing slightly more than they should. Paulina was growing up in the margins of this world. She was 7 years old in 1932, 8 in 1933, 9 in 1934. She attended a private school in Washington, a small institution for daughters of prominent families. Alice rarely attended school events. Mrs. Crawford managed Paulina's schedule, her clothing, and her homework. Paulina was quiet, obedient, and easily overlooked. Alice saw her at breakfast occasionally and sometimes in the evenings, but their interactions were brief. Alice asked if Paulina had finished her schoolwork. Paulina said yes. Alice said good. The conversation ended. Paulina was not invited to the dinners. Children were excluded, always. Alice's salon was for adults, for power brokers and gossip, and people who understood the rules. Paulina stayed upstairs with Mrs. Crawford while the guests arrived, ate, argued, and left. Sometimes Paulina stood at the top of the stairs and listened to the voices below. Alice caught her once and told her to go to bed. Paulina obeyed without argument. Alice's wit became famous. She said things others thought but would not say aloud. When a senator gave a long-winded speech, Alice said he could bore the paint off a wall. When a colleague proposed a bill Alice considered idiotic, she said so directly in front of others. The insults spread. People repeated them, laughing, attributing them to Alice with a mix of admiration and fear. Alice cultivated this reputation deliberately. Being feared was more useful than being liked. She had a needlepoint pillow made in 1935. It read, "If you haven't got anything nice to say, come sit by me." The pillow sat on a chair in her drawing room, visible to every guest. The phrase became associated with Alice permanently. She liked that. It was honest, and honesty was rare in Washington. Bora attended the dinners occasionally. He and Alice maintained the affair, though it had cooled over the years. They were both older now, Alice 50, Bora 70. The physical aspect had diminished. They still met, still talked, still found each other useful. But the urgency was gone. They had settled into a pattern of mutual companionship that required nothing and promised nothing. By 1937, Alice had been hosting her salon for 5 years. It had become an institution. Invitations were coveted. Attendance was noted. The conversations that happened in Alice's drawing room shaped policy indirectly, influenced appointments, and ended careers. Alice never claimed credit. She simply hosted dinners and let the guests destroy themselves. Paulina turned 12 in 1937. She was tall for her age, thin with dark hair and a serious expression. She resembled Bora more than Nicholas, though no one mentioned this aloud. Alice noticed the resemblance and ignored it. Paulina was enrolled in a boarding school that fall, a decision Alice made without consulting her. Mrs. Crawford packed Paulina's belongings. Paulina left without complaint. Alice felt relief. The house was quieter without a child in it. The salon continued. Alice's influence grew. She mocked Roosevelt's court-packing plan in 1937, and her mockery was repeated by senators who opposed it. She ridiculed his economic policies, his appointments, and his leadership. Roosevelt's allies avoided her. His enemies courted her. Alice remained useful to both. She was 53 years old in 1937, a widow with no official position and more influence than most elected officials. She had built this influence carefully, over years, through strategic cruelty and careful listening. She had no husband, no affection, no warmth. She had power instead. It was not what she had wanted as a girl, but it was what she had, and she used it. Paulina returned from boarding school in the summers. She was quiet during these visits, reading in her room, avoiding the drawing room when guests arrived. Alice saw her at meals and sometimes in the afternoons, but they did not speak beyond necessities. Paulina asked if she could stay in Washington for the summer of 1938. Alice said no. Boarding school was better. Paulina returned to school in the fall without argument. The school was in Connecticut, a small institution for girls whose families wanted them educated but not too visible. Paulina studied adequately, but without distinction. Her teachers reported that she was withdrawn, reluctant to participate in group activities, isolated from the other girls. Alice received these reports and filed them away. She did not visit the school. She wrote brief letters to Paulina once a month, asking about her studies and signing her name. Paulina's responses were shorter, confirming she was well and nothing more. In 1940, Paulina graduated. She was 15 years old, too young for college, too old for boarding school. Alice enrolled her in a finishing school in New York, another holding place. Paulina spent a year learning deportment, conversational French, and how to arrange flowers. She hated it, but said nothing. Alice visited once in the spring of 1941 and found Paulina thinner, paler, her eyes circled with shadows. Alice asked if she was sleeping well. Paulina said she was fine. Alice left the next morning. The United States entered World War II in December 1941. Washington transformed overnight. The city was filled with soldiers, defense workers, bureaucrats managing the war effort. Alice's salon adapted. The guests changed. More military officials, fewer journalists, cabinet members focused on strategy rather than politics. Alice hosted dinners throughout the war, listening to discussions about rationing, production, troop movements. She learned things she was not supposed to know and kept most of it to herself. Paulina turned 17 in 1942. She finished the New York school and returned to Washington with no clear purpose. Alice did not know what to do with her. Paulina was too young to live independently, too old to be managed like a child. Alice hired a tutor to teach her typing and shorthand, skills that might lead to employment. Paulina learned both without enthusiasm. Bora died in January 1940 before the war began. He had been 74, still serving in the Senate, still arguing against involvement in European conflicts. He collapsed in his office and died within hours. Alice learned of his death from a phone call. She attended the funeral, sitting in the back, unnoticed among the crowd of dignitaries. She felt nothing sharp, only a dull awareness that something had ended. She did not speak about him afterward. Paulina began attending social events in 1943, young women's luncheons and charity functions organized by Washington Society. Alice insisted on this. Paulina needed to be seen, needed to meet appropriate young men, needed to position herself for marriage. Paulina attended without protest. She wore dresses Alice selected, smiled when required, answered questions briefly. She met no one interesting. The young men at these events were either too old or too young, either heading to war or recovering from it. In 1944, Paulina met Alexander Sturm. He was 26, recently discharged from the Army after an injury, studying art history with family money that required no employment. He was from a prominent Connecticut family, charming in a careless way, handsome enough. He approached Paulina at a reception and asked if she was Theodore Roosevelt's granddaughter. Paulina said yes. Alexander said he had always admired Theodore's writing. They spoke for an hour. Paulina seemed interested, which Alice noticed. Alexander began courting Paulina formally. He called on her at the M Street house, brought flowers, took her to dinners and theater performances. Alice approved initially. Alexander came from the right kind of family, had the right kind of manners, and seemed sufficiently ambitious. Paulina was 19, old enough to marry, and Alice wanted the matter settled. A daughter who married well was a daughter who no longer required management. The engagement was announced in 1945, shortly after the war ended. The wedding was planned for that fall. Alice organized it efficiently. Small ceremony, limited guest list, reception at the house. Paulina agreed to everything. She seemed neither happy nor unhappy, only compliant. Alice assumed this was normal. Her own marriage had been the same. The wedding took place in October 1945. Paulina wore a simple white dress. Alexander wore a dark suit. Alice hosted the reception, inviting senators and journalists and people whose attendance was politically useful. Paulina and Alexander stood in the receiving line, greeting guests. Paulina's smile looked practiced. Alice noticed but said nothing. The marriage failed quickly. Alexander had no profession, no income beyond family money, and no ambition to acquire either. He spent his days reading, attending gallery openings, drinking with friends who also had inherited wealth and idle lives. Paulina stayed home, managing their small apartment. Cooking meals Alexander barely touched. She wrote to Alice occasionally, brief letters describing nothing important. Alice wrote back even more briefly. By 1946, Paulina was pregnant. She wrote to Alice in the spring, saying the baby would arrive in the fall. Alice replied with congratulations that felt obligatory. She did not visit. She did not offer help. She assumed Paulina would manage, the way women always managed. Joanna Sturm was born in October 1946. Paulina was 21 years old. The delivery was difficult, but both mother and daughter survived. Alice received a telegram with the news. She sent flowers and a check. She did not visit the hospital. She met Joanna for the first time when Paulina brought her to Washington for Christmas. The baby was small, red-faced, crying frequently. Alice held her briefly and handed her back. Paulina looked exhausted, her face pale, her hair unwashed. Alice asked if she was well. Paulina said she was managing. Alexander was not present for Christmas. Paulina said he had gone to Connecticut to visit his family. Alice suspected he had simply left. Paulina did not elaborate. She stayed in Washington for 3 days, then returned to New York. Alice did not see her again for months. The marriage deteriorated further. Alexander drank more, contributed less, and eventually stopped pretending he cared. Paulina filed for divorce in 1948. The process was quick and uncontested. Alexander did not fight for custody of Joanna. Paulina was granted the divorce and returned to Washington with her daughter. She moved into a small apartment and asked Alice for money. Alice provided it, along with advice Paulina did not want. Find another husband, raise the child properly, stop looking so defeated. Paulina listened in silence and left. Paulina moved into an apartment on Q Street in 1948, a small 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building that needed repairs. The walls were thin, the plumbing unreliable. Joanna, 2 years old, cried often, her voice carrying through the walls. Paulina hired a woman to help with childcare during the day, paying her with money Alice provided monthly. The checks arrived without accompanying letters. Paulina cashed them in and said nothing. Alice saw Paulina infrequently during these years. Paulina would bring Joanna to the M Street house for occasional visits, staying less than an hour. The child was difficult, fussy, demanding, prone to tantrums. Paulina looked worn each time, her clothes poorly fitted, her hair uncombed. Alice offered no comfort. She asked if Paulina was managing her finances responsibly. Paulina said yes. Alice said the apartment was inadequate. Paulina said it was what she could afford. Alice said she was providing enough money for something better. Paulina did not argue. She gathered Joanna and left. In 1949, Paulina began drinking. She started with wine in the evenings after Joanna was asleep, then earlier in the day, then throughout the day. She drank to quiet the panic that had settled in her chest, the awareness that she was 24 years old, divorced, living on her mother's money, responsible for a child she had not wanted and did not know how to love. The drinking helped briefly, then stopped helping, then became necessary. The woman Paulina hired to care for Joanna quit in 1950 after finding Paulina unconscious on the couch at noon. Paulina hired another woman who lasted 3 months before also quitting. Paulina stopped hiring help. She kept Joanna home, fed her irregularly, let her watch while she drank. Joanna learned early to be quiet, to stay out of the way, to not ask for things. Alice learned about the drinking from a neighbor who wrote to her anonymously in 1951. The letter described Paulina's condition, the neglect of the child, the smell of alcohol permeating the hallway. Alice confronted Paulina during a visit. Paulina denied everything. Alice could smell the wine on her breath. Alice said Paulina was humiliating herself and damaging Joanna. Paulina said Alice had no right to judge her. Alice said she had every right. Paulina asked Alice to leave. Alice left. Paulina attempted sobriety once in 1952. She stopped drinking for 6 weeks, attending church meetings where women shared stories of recovery. She brought Joanna with her, the child sitting quietly in the back while Paulina listened. The sobriety lasted until Paulina received a letter from Alexander asking for money. He had spent his inheritance and needed help. Paulina sent him nothing but started drinking that night. In 1953, Paulina met a man named William. He worked for the government in some undefined clerical capacity, lived in an apartment near hers, and drank as much as she did. They began spending evenings together, drinking cheap wine and complaining about their lives. William was kind to Joanna occasionally, bringing her candy or letting her sit beside him while he read the newspaper. Paulina thought he might be a solution. They discussed marriage once, late at night, both drunk. William said he would think about it. He never mentioned it again. By 1954, he had moved to another apartment and stopped visiting. Alice invited Paulina to the M Street house for Thanksgiving in 1955. Paulina arrived late, bringing Joanna, who was now 9 years old. The child was thin, poorly dressed, wearing shoes that did not fit. Alice's guests, senators and journalists and their wives, stared. Paulina was drunk, her speech slurred, her movements unsteady. Alice sent her home before dinner was served. Paulina did not argue. She took Joanna's hand and left. Alice did not invite her again. By 1956, Paulina was seeing a psychiatrist. Alice had arranged it, paying for sessions Paulina attended sporadically. The psychiatrist prescribed medication, phenobarbital for anxiety, other pills Paulina could not name. She took them inconsistently, sometimes taking too many, sometimes none at all. The psychiatrist noted this in his records but did not intervene. Paulina stopped attending sessions in the fall. In early 1957, Paulina called Alice and asked if Joanna could stay at the M Street house for a few weeks. She said she needed time to rest, to organize her life. Alice agreed. Joanna arrived with a small suitcase. She was quiet, polite, and careful not to cause trouble. Alice found her presence tolerable. She enrolled Joanna in a local school temporarily, hired a woman to supervise her after classes, and saw her at dinner. Joanna did not ask when her mother would return. Alice did not offer information. Paulina called once during those weeks. She sounded distant, her voice flat. Alice asked when she would collect Joanna. Paulina said soon. Alice said Joanna could not stay indefinitely. Paulina said she understood. The call ended. Alice assumed Paulina was drinking again. She was correct. On January 27, 1957, Paulina Longworth Sturm was found dead in her apartment. A neighbor had noticed the smell and called the building superintendent, who unlocked the door. Paulina was on her bed, fully clothed, her face turned toward the wall. Empty pill bottles were on the nightstand. The coroner later determined she had taken a lethal combination of phenobarbital and alcohol. The death was ruled accidental, an overdose, not suicide. Alice was notified by telephone. Alice went to the apartment that evening. The police had already removed Paulina's body. The apartment was squalid, unwashed dishes in the sink, stale air, clothing piled on furniture. Alice stood in the doorway, looked around once, and left. She arranged for the apartment to be cleared, the belongings discarded. She kept nothing. The funeral was small. Alice invited no one. Paulina was buried in Rock Creek Cemetery in a plot Alice purchased without consulting anyone. The gravestone was simple, listing only Paulina's name and dates. Alice attended the burial with Joanna, who stood silently beside her, holding Alice's hand. Alice did not cry. Joanna did not cry. They stood until the casket was lowered, then left. Alice took custody of Joanna officially in February. The court approved without complication. Joanna moved into the M Street house, taking a bedroom on the third floor. Alice hired a woman to supervise her, the same way she had hired Mrs. Crawford decades earlier. Joanna attended school, completed her homework, and caused no trouble. Alice saw her at meals and asked if she needed anything. Joanna said no. The arrangement settled into routine quickly. Neither of them spoke about Paulina. The name was not mentioned. The absence was acknowledged only through silence. Joanna Sturm grew up in Alice's house the way Alice had grown up in Theodore's. Present but peripheral, cared for but not loved. Alice was 72 years old when she took custody of her granddaughter, too old for the demands of raising a child, too stubborn to admit it. She hired staff to manage the daily requirements, a housekeeper, a woman to supervise Joanna after school, a tutor when Joanna's grades faltered. Alice provided structure, discipline, and money. She did not provide affection. Joanna was quiet, observant, careful not to create problems. She had learned from her mother's life that visibility led to judgment, and she kept herself small. She attended school in Washington, a private institution where daughters of diplomats and politicians studied without distinction. Joanna's teachers noted that she was intelligent but withdrawn, reluctant to participate, isolated from her peers. Alice received these reports and filed them without comment. She had received similar reports about Paulina years earlier and had ignored them. She did the same with Joanna. The salon continued. Alice hosted dinners throughout the late 1950s and into the 1960s, her guest list evolving with the changing political landscape. Eisenhower's administration brought different faces: moderate Republicans, defense officials, men concerned with Soviet expansion and nuclear strategy. Alice mocked Eisenhower privately, calling him a soldier playing president, but she invited his staff anyway. Information was valuable regardless of its source. Joanna was not included in the dinners. She stayed upstairs while the guests arrived, ate, argued, and departed. Sometimes she stood at the top of the stairs and listened, the same way Paulina had done decades before. Alice caught her once and said nothing. Joanna returned to her room. Alice turned 80 in 1964. The newspapers marked the occasion with profiles describing her as Washington's Grand Dame, a living relic of political history. Reporters came to the M Street house to interview her. Alice received them in her drawing room, the famous needlepoint pillow visible on the chair beside her. She spoke about her father, about the politicians she had known, about the decades she had observed. She did not mention Paulina. She mentioned Joanna only when asked, describing her as a quiet girl who lived with her. The reporters did not press for details. The salon became smaller in the 1960s. Alice was older, less energetic, less interested in the performance. She still hosted dinners, but less frequently, once a week instead of twice, sometimes once every 2 weeks. The guests were older as well, senators who had served for decades, journalists near retirement. Younger politicians attended occasionally out of curiosity or obligation, but they found Alice's wit sharper than they expected, and often did not return. Joanna Sturm grew up in Alice's house the way Alice had grown up in Theodore's, present but peripheral, cared for but not loved. Alice was 72 years old when she took custody of her granddaughter, too old for the demands of raising a child, too stubborn to admit it. She hired staff to manage the daily requirements: a housekeeper, a woman to supervise Joanna after school, a tutor when Joanna's grades faltered. Alice provided structure, discipline, and money. She did not provide affection. Joanna was quiet, observant, careful not to create problems. She had learned from her mother's life that visibility led to judgment, and she kept herself small. She attended school in Washington, a private institution where daughters of diplomats and politicians studied without distinction. Joanna's teachers noted that she was intelligent but withdrawn, reluctant to participate, isolated from her peers. Alice received these reports and filed them without comment. She had received similar reports about Paulina years earlier and had ignored them. She did the same with Joanna. The salon continued. Alice hosted dinners throughout the late 1950s and into the 1960s, her guest list evolving with the changing political landscape. Eisenhower's administration brought different faces: moderate Republicans, defense officials, men concerned with Soviet expansion and nuclear strategy. Alice mocked Eisenhower privately, calling him a soldier playing president, but she invited his staff anyway. Information was valuable regardless of its source. Joanna was not included in the dinners. She stayed upstairs while the guests arrived, ate, argued, and departed. Sometimes she stood at the top of the stairs and listened, the same way Paulina had done decades before. Alice caught her once and said nothing. Joanna returned to her room. Alice turned 80 in 1964. The newspapers marked the occasion with profiles describing her as Washington's Grand Dame, a living relic of political history. Reporters came to the M Street house to interview her. Alice received them in her drawing room, the famous needlepoint pillow visible on the chair beside her. She spoke about her father, about the politicians she had known, about the decades she had observed. She did not mention Paulina. She mentioned Joanna only when asked, describing her as a quiet girl who lived with her. The reporters did not press for details. The salon became smaller in the 1960s. Alice was older, less energetic, less interested in the performance. She still hosted dinners, but less frequently. Once a week instead of twice, sometimes once every 2 weeks. The guests were older as well, senators who had served for decades, journalists near retirement. Younger politicians attended occasionally out of curiosity or obligation, but they found Alice's wit sharper than they expected, and often did not return. By 1970, Alice was 86 years old. The salon had become erratic. She hosted dinners when she had the energy, canceled them when she did not. The guests adapted, understanding that Alice's health was failing even if she would not admit it. She still mocked presidents, still insulted senators, still wielded cruelty with precision. But the performances were shorter now, less frequent, and the guests left earlier. Alice refused help. She dismissed suggestions that she hire more staff, that she move to a smaller home, that she consider her limitations. She lived alone in the M Street house with a housekeeper who came daily and a cook who prepared meals Alice barely ate. She read less, her eyesight too poor. She listened to the radio following political developments, calling journalists to offer commentary they still printed. Joanna called occasionally, brief conversations that covered nothing important. Alice asked if Joanna was working. Joanna said yes. Alice asked if she needed money. Joanna said no. The calls lasted 5 minutes. Neither of them mentioned Paulina. The silence around her death had become permanent, a fact neither acknowledged, but both maintained. Alice turned 90 in 1974. The newspapers marked the occasion again, describing her longevity, her wit, her decades of influence. She gave no interviews. She stayed in her house alone, reading when she could, remembering when she could not. The salon had ended by then, quietly, without announcement. The guests stopped coming. Alice stopped inviting them. The house grew quieter. Alice Roosevelt Longworth turned 92 in 1976, the year of the American bicentennial. The nation celebrated its founding with parades, fireworks, tall ships sailing into harbors. Alice watched some of it on television, a device she had resisted for years but finally allowed into her drawing room. She found the celebrations excessive, the patriotism performative. She told a reporter who called that the country was not worth celebrating in its current state. The quote appeared in print the next day. Alice was pleased. She was physically diminished by then. She walked with a cane, her hands gnarled from arthritis, her back curved from osteoporosis. Her face had thinned, the skin papery and spotted, but her eyes remained sharp. She still wore her hair in the same style she had worn for decades, pinned back severely, gray now, but meticulously maintained. She dressed each day in tailored dresses or suits, refusing to adopt the casual clothing other elderly women wore. Appearance was still a form of control. The house on M Street had grown shabby. The wallpaper was faded, the furniture worn, the carpets frayed at the edges. Alice refused to update anything. She said the house was fine as it was. The housekeeper cleaned what could be cleaned, and ignored the rest. Alice spent most of her time in the drawing room, sitting in her usual chair, the needlepoint pillow beside her. Visitors came less frequently now, but when they did, Alice received them with the same sharpness she had always possessed. Jimmy Carter won the presidency in 1976. Alice detested him immediately. She found him sanctimonious, his folksiness calculated, his moralism irritating. She mocked his smile, his southern accent, his insistence on carrying his own luggage. She told a journalist that Carter was a Sunday school teacher pretending to be a president. The journalist printed it. Carter's staff was informed. Carter, unlike Johnson or Nixon, seemed genuinely hurt. Alice considered that a weakness. Reporters still sought her out for commentary. She was a relic now, the last surviving child of Theodore Roosevelt, a woman who had known every president since McKinley. They came to her house with tape recorders and notebooks, asking about the past. Alice answered selectively. She spoke about her father when she chose to, usually to contrast his vigor with the inadequacy of current leaders. She spoke about the politicians she had known, always emphasizing their failures. She did not speak about Paulina. When asked about family, she mentioned Joanna briefly and changed the subject. Joanna visited in 1977, her first visit in 3 years. She was 31 years old, unmarried, still working at the museum in New York. She had inherited her mother's quietness and her grandmother's sharp features, but none of Alice's cruelty. She stayed for 2 days, sleeping in her old bedroom. She and Alice ate meals together, spoke little, and parted without warmth. Alice asked why Joanna had not married. Joanna said she had no interest in marriage. Alice said that was foolish. Joanna said it was her decision. Alice did not argue further. Alice fell in 1978, tripping on a rug in the hallway. She lay on the floor for 20 minutes before the housekeeper found her. The housekeeper called an ambulance. Alice was taken to the hospital, where doctors determined she had fractured her hip. She underwent surgery, spent 2 weeks recovering, and returned home against medical advice. The doctors said she needed physical therapy, ongoing care, and assistance with daily activities. Alice dismissed all of it. She hired a nurse to stay at the house for a month, then fired her when the month ended. She managed with the housekeeper's help and refused to discuss her limitations. The pain from the hip never fully resolved. Alice walked with greater difficulty, relying on the cane constantly. She stopped going outside. The last time she left the house was in early 1979, for a doctor's appointment she could not avoid. She rode in a car driven by the housekeeper's husband, her body rigid with pain, her face expressionless. The appointment lasted 15 minutes. Alice refused further visits. She would see no more doctors. No more. Alice Roosevelt Longworth turned 92 in 1976, the year of the American bicentennial. The nation celebrated its founding with parades, fireworks, tall ships sailing into harbors. Alice watched some of it on television, a device she had resisted for years but finally allowed into her drawing room. She found the celebrations excessive, the patriotism performative. She told a reporter who called that the country was not worth celebrating in its current state. The quote appeared in print the next day. Alice was pleased. She was physically diminished by then. She walked with a cane, her hands gnarled from arthritis, her back curved from osteoporosis. Her face had thinned, the skin papery and spotted, but her eyes remained sharp. She still wore her hair in the same style she had worn for decades, pinned back severely, gray now, but meticulously maintained. She dressed each day in tailored dresses or suits, refusing to adopt the casual clothing other elderly women wore. Appearance was still a form of control. The house on M Street had grown shabby. The wallpaper was faded, the furniture worn, the carpets frayed at the edges. Alice refused to update anything. She said the house was fine as it was. The housekeeper cleaned what could be cleaned and ignored the rest. Alice spent most of her time in the drawing room, sitting in her usual chair, the needlepoint pillow beside her. Visitors came less frequently now, but when they did, Alice received them with the same sharpness she had always possessed. Jimmy Carter won the presidency in 1976. Alice detested him immediately. She found him sanctimonious, his folksiness calculated, his moralism irritating. She mocked his smile, his southern accent, his insistence on carrying his own luggage. She told a journalist that Carter was a Sunday school teacher pretending to be a president. The journalist printed it. Carter's staff was informed. Carter, unlike Johnson or Nixon, seemed genuinely hurt. Alice considered that a weakness. Reporters still sought her out for commentary. She was a relic now, the last surviving child of Theodore Roosevelt, a woman who had known every president since McKinley. They came to her house with tape recorders and notebooks, asking about the past. Alice answered selectively. She spoke about her father when she chose to, usually to contrast his vigor with the inadequacy of current leaders. She spoke about the politicians she had known, always emphasizing their failures. She did not speak about Paulina. When asked about family, she mentioned Joanna briefly and changed the subject. Joanna visited in 1977, her first visit in 3 years. She was 31 years old, unmarried, still working at the museum in New York. She had inherited her mother's quietness and her grandmother's sharp features, but none of Alice's cruelty. She stayed for 2 days, sleeping in her old bedroom. She and Alice ate meals together, spoke little, and parted without warmth. Alice asked why Joanna had not married. Joanna said she had no interest in marriage. Alice said that was foolish. Joanna said it was her decision. Alice did not argue further. Alice fell in 1978, tripping on a rug in the hallway. She lay on the floor for 20 minutes before the housekeeper found her. The housekeeper called an ambulance. Alice was taken to the hospital, where doctors determined she had fractured her hip. She underwent surgery, spent 2 weeks recovering, and returned home against medical advice. The doctors said she needed physical therapy, ongoing care, and assistance with daily activities. Alice dismissed all of it. She hired a nurse to stay at the house for a month, then fired her when the month ended. She managed with the housekeeper's help and refused to discuss her limitations. The pain from the hip never fully resolved. Alice walked with greater difficulty, relying on the cane constantly. She stopped going outside. The last time she left the house was in early 1979, for a doctor's appointment she could not avoid. She rode in a car driven by the housekeeper's husband, her body rigid with pain, her face expressionless. The appointment lasted 15 minutes. Alice refused further visits. She would see no more doctors. No more. Alice Roosevelt Longworth died on February 20th, 1980, in her home on M Street. The housekeeper found her in the morning, sitting in her chair in the drawing room, her head tilted to one side, her eyes closed. She had died sometime during the night, quietly, alone. The housekeeper called Joanna in New York. Joanna said she would take the next train to Washington. She arrived that evening. The funeral was planned quickly. Joanna made the arrangements with help from a funeral director who had handled services for other prominent Washington families. The service was held at St. John's Episcopal Church on Lafayette Square, the same church where Theodore Roosevelt had worshipped when he was president. The church was half full. Senators attended, a few elderly journalists, people who had known Alice decades earlier and felt obligated to appear. Joanna sat in the front row, alone. No one sat beside her. The service was brief. A minister who had never met Alice delivered generic remarks about her long life and her connection to history. He did not mention her cruelty, her failed marriage, her distant relationship with her daughter. He spoke about Theodore Roosevelt at length, as though Alice's significance existed only in relation to her father. Joanna listened without expression. The service ended after 30 minutes. Alice was buried at Rock Creek Cemetery, near Paulina's grave, though the two plots were not adjacent. The obituaries appeared the next day in newspapers across the country. They described Alice as the last surviving child of Theodore Roosevelt, a Washington fixture who had known 12 presidents, a woman famous for her wit and her sharp tongue. The New York Times called her the other Washington monument. The Washington Post printed a collection of her most famous insults. The obituaries mentioned her marriage to Nicholas Longworth, her years as a hostess, and her influence during the mid-20th century. They mentioned Paulina only in passing, noting that she had predeceased her mother. They barely mentioned Joanna at all. Joanna inherited everything: the house, the furniture, the small estate Alice had accumulated over decades. There was less money than expected. Alice had lived modestly in her final years, spending little, but she had also saved little. The house was valuable, but it required repairs Joanna could not afford. She hired an estate attorney to manage the probate process and returned to New York while the legal matters were settled. The house was sold in the fall of 1980. Joanna accepted the first reasonable offer, unwilling to delay. The buyers were a young couple, both lawyers, who planned to renovate completely. They wanted the location, not the history. Joanna returned to Washington in October to oversee the removal of Alice's belongings. An auction house had agreed to sell the furniture, the china, the accumulated possessions of 96 years. Joanna walked through the house one final time before the auction. The rooms were empty, stripped of furniture, the walls bare where paintings had hung. The drawing room looked smaller without Alice's chair, without the needlepoint pillow, without the presence that had dominated the space for decades. Joanna stood in the doorway, remembering dinners she had listened to from the stairs, remembering Alice sitting in her chair, sharp and cold and unreachable. She felt nothing sharp, only exhaustion. The auction was held in November. Collectors came, dealers, people interested in Roosevelt memorabilia. The furniture sold quickly. Alice's desk, her chairs, the dining table where senators had eaten. The needlepoint pillow sold for more than expected, purchased by a museum that wanted it for a political history exhibit. Joanna watched from the back of the room. She had kept almost nothing. A few photographs, a letter from Theodore Roosevelt to Alice, a small clock that had sat on Alice's desk. Everything else was sold. The papers were donated to the Library of Congress. Boxes of letters, photographs, newspaper clippings, decades of correspondence with politicians, journalists, family members. Archivists would sort through it, catalog it, make it available to researchers. Joanna signed the donation papers without reading them. She did not want the responsibility of managing Alice's archive. She wanted the matter finished. The house was emptied by December. The new owners took possession and began renovations immediately. They tore down walls, replaced the plumbing, repainted everything. Within months, the house bore no resemblance to the place where Alice had lived. The drawing room where senators had gathered became an open-concept kitchen. The bedroom where Alice had died became a home office. The history was erased, replaced by granite countertops and recessed lighting. Joanna returned to New York and did not look back. She continued working at the museum, living in the same small apartment, maintaining the quiet life she had built. She gave one interview about Alice to a historian writing a book about Theodore Roosevelt's children. Joanna answered questions briefly, offering no personal reflections. She described Alice as distant, intelligent, and difficult. When asked if they had been close, Joanna said no. The historian asked what Alice had been like as a grandmother. Joanna said she did not know. The interview lasted 20 minutes. The books about Alice began appearing in the years after her death. Biographies, histories of Washington society, accounts of the Roosevelt family. They described Alice's wit, her influence, her decades in Washington. They included the famous quotes, the insults that had ended careers, the stories reporters had collected over decades. They mentioned the needlepoint pillow, the salon, the presidents she had mocked. They treated her as a historical figure, fascinating and untouchable. The books mentioned Paulina's death, usually in a single paragraph. They noted the overdose, the tragic end, the fact that Alice had raised Joanna afterward. They did not examine the relationship between Alice and Paulina, the coldness that had defined it, the distance that had never closed. They did not ask whether Alice bore responsibility for her daughter's despair. The narrative preferred to focus on Alice's wit, her longevity, her proximity to power. The darkness was acknowledged but not explored. Joanna read none of these books. She was asked occasionally to contribute to them, to provide family stories or correct factual errors. She declined every request. She had no interest in preserving Alice's legacy or correcting it. She had survived Alice's household, and that was enough. By 1985, 5 years after Alice's death, the house on M Street had been sold again. The second owners were older, wealthier, interested in historic preservation. They restored some of the original features, replaced the modern renovations with period-appropriate details. They hosted dinner parties, told guests that Alice Roosevelt Longworth had once lived there, pointed out the room where she had entertained senators. The guests found this interesting. They asked questions about Alice, repeated the famous quotes, and laughed at the stories. The house became a curiosity, a footnote, a place where something important had happened decades earlier. Alice herself had become the same. Alice Roosevelt Longworth lived for 96 years, knew 12 presidents, and left behind a collection of quotes that are still repeated in Washington. Her wit is preserved in books, her insults cataloged by historians, her needlepoint pillow displayed in a museum. She is remembered as sharp, influential, untouchable. The memory is accurate as far as it goes. What the memory does not include is the silence in the house after the guests left, the daughter who died alone in a shabby apartment, the granddaughter who inherited coldness instead of affection. It does not include the years Alice spent performing confidence while feeling none, or the marriage she endured without love, or the fact that the influence she wielded never filled the absence at the center of her life. Alice wanted to be necessary because she could not be loved. She succeeded. Senators feared her, journalists quoted her, presidents resented her. She shaped conversations, ended careers, and maintained her position for decades. But the position required a kind of hardness that could not be turned off, and by the time she was old enough to reconsider, the hardness had become permanent. Paulina's death was ruled accidental. The word suggests misfortune, an error in judgment, a moment of miscalculation. It does not suggest decades of distance, a mother who could not offer warmth, a childhood spent in the margins of someone else's performance. The ruling was legally correct and factually incomplete. Joanna survived, which is not the same as thriving. She built a life away from Washington, away from the house where Alice had reigned, away from the legacy she had no interest in inheriting. She did not speak about Alice often, and when she did, her descriptions were careful, measured, empty of affection. She had learned from her grandmother how to keep people at a distance. The lesson was effective. Alice Roosevelt Longworth died in her chair in the room where she had entertained power for half a century. The house was sold, the furniture auctioned, the papers archived. What remains is the wit, the reputation, the image of a woman who could wound with words and did so without hesitation. Whether she ever wanted anything else is a question no one thought to ask while she was alive, and she left no answer behind.